A little under half a year after Sonic 1 hit the market in June of 1991, development on Sonic 2 began at roughly the same time as when Sega of Japan was getting this fancy new add-on for the Sega Mega Drive, the Sega Mega CD, out the doors. The company knew they had to bring Sonic to this system, and after contemplating enhanced ports of Sonic 1 and possibly Sonic 2, they came to a decision to create an entirely new title that would take full advantage of the expanded hardware capabilities. Seeing as Sonic 1's programmer/producer Yuji Naka and level designer Hirokazu Yasuhara were busy working on Sonic 2 over at Sega Technical Institute in San Francisco, however, it was evident somebody else needed to step in. This person would be nobody else than Aoto Oshima, the character designer of Sonic, who stayed behind in Sega of Japan after the original game had been finished. With Oshima behind the helmet for Sonic CD, it ended up being pretty different from its Mega Drive siblings, which has split many fans on the quality of the game. Some love it, some are more ambivalent towards it, and some dislike it, period. With this retrospective, we're going to be analyzing the game's design in depth and find out where I sit on this wide spectrum of opinions. The experiences of Sonic 1 and 2 are hard to describe and encompass in a few sentences, but break them down to brass tags and you've got three main elements: platforming, speed, and exploration. The core drive behind the gameplay then is mastering the physics and mechanics, as well as memorizing layouts to blaze through the games faster and faster. The stages have multiple branching routes and secrets everywhere with items in them to incentivize exploration, and through this exploration, you could often even find shortcuts or other methods of getting through quicker than normal once you gain the necessary skills. All these things combined make for highly replayable games, and though Sonic 1 suffered from first game syndrome with a lot of experimentation, in Sonic 2 stuff was balanced with one another to such a degree that there was room for a number of varying playstyles throughout, from taking your time with exploring everything to setting record times in stages and the game as a whole. Then we jump over to Sonic CD, and they've clearly prioritized one of these elements, causing another one to fall behind. The story here is pretty basic nonsense as always, but nevertheless that Robotnik has invaded a mysterious planet floating in the sky named Little Planet and is attempting to take it over to serve his evil ways. To achieve that goal, the maniacal doctor has placed machines all over the surface of this otherworldly globe, which poop out hordes of Batniks programmed to reconstruct everything to their boss's wishes. For you as the player, this means you shouldn't only think of rings, extra lives, and power-ups to explore for throughout the adventure, but also the total of 14 robot generators. Yes, Acts 1 and 2 of each of the 7 zones in Sonic CD have a robot generator to look out for, and this is quite the involved task with a lot of potential to be a great addition to the gameplay. The stages, for one thing, are pretty large, yet just the right size. They aren't necessarily long when going from left to right, but they do have much verticality to them, with an abundance of nooks and crannies to investigate. This is nice because it means levels don't overstay their welcome when you just want to get to the end, but can become rather expensive if you do decide to explore them. It's kind of like Sonic 1 and 2 in that regard, but Sonic CD's levels definitely focus much more on exploration as a core element. One of the main reasons for that is that all of the layouts are constructed to be very backtrackable, to accommodate this heavier emphasis on exploration. Sonic 1 and 2 also have a portion of stages that are backtrackable, but I get the impression that was more of a happy accident whenever it was the case. In Sonic CD, on the other hand, each and every stage is indeed fully or at least near fully backtrackable. Even Collision Chaos 2, where I always assumed you cannot go back once you reach this part right before the goal, well, if you continue to build up speed via this slope and then jump off at the right interval, you can nudge yourself towards this pipe on the left and travel all the way back to the start of the act. I think Tidal Tempest 1 has a point of no return around the halfway mark, but the roboticizer lies beyond that anyway, so it's okay. It's a good thing that the developers realized backtrackability was an important aspect of the levels they had to get right, because the robot generators could have been a pain in the ass to find otherwise. Be that as it may, I'm gonna tell you up front that, sadly, despite the promising concept of the robot generators and good backtrackability of the stages, I think the quest is brought down by some poor poor design choices. To begin with, a select few of these generators are obscure to the point that finding them can completely kill the pace of your playthrough. The first one is in Wacky Workbench 1. See, there's this hole in this crusher thing you have to fall into to be magically transported to a locked off section in the map containing the robot generator, but the visual design really does not hint at a hole in the crusher at all. Conventional Sonic wisdom would have you avoid crushers, so the only way I feel you could possibly figure this out then is by sheer accident or by snooping up the information online nowadays. Debatably even worse though is Metallic Madness 2. This stage is a bloody fucking maze, boasting pipes that transport you to various areas, with some of them being dead ends while others loop you around to earlier sections of the map. Navigation of it all is confusing, and there's really no clue or indication of where what is and leads to, so it's like finding a needle in a haystack. What also doesn't help is that you cannot obliterate robot generators in the present or future, only in the past. This is a whole problematic aspect on its own that I'll dive into in a moment, but Metallic Madness 2 has an extra issue when in the past. This ledge right here, that's a cunt, because you can barely not get on top of it unless you go back to the present. You have to imagine aimlessly stumbling around in the stage, looking around every inch of this perplexing maze for an exit, only to realize you have to go back to the present for some arbitrary reason. To be completely fair, these are the only two instances of outright bad roboticizers I can bring up. Most of these suckers are placed in very reasonable locations, encouraging exploration without being obtuse. Palm Tree Panic, Collision Chaos, Tidal Tempest, Quartz Quadrant, Stardust Speedway, hunting down the generators in those zones can be pretty fun and satisfying. Here is the first catch though. You cannot revisit stages you have finished, and you have to destroy all the generators in the game for the good ending. This means missing even one of these devices essentially equals missing all of them, and that your ass is locked into a level until you find its robot generator. Not only that, if you do miss a zone's roboticizers, you have no other option than to start over from the very beginning of the game if you want the good ending. This is especially problematic when you consider that the game does not directly teach or inform you about the existence of the robot generators. What? You only realize by the third zone there are robot generators to destroy? Cry some more, bitch boy, back to square one. This is just archaic, especially considering it's 1993 and that Sonic CD has a save system. A lot of contemporaries before, around, and after 1993 allow players to go back to previous levels to obtain stuff they've missed. Sonic CD says bugger that, and it kinda sucks. Now, I've dropped mentions about the past, present, and future just a moment ago, and how the robot generators can only be destroyed in the past. This leads us to what is likely the most defining gimmick of Sonic CD, the time travel. The premise is that for each zone there is the past version where Robotnik had just begun his invasion and started planting his robot generators, the present version where Sonic arrives at Little Planet with Robotnik slowly taking over, and then the future version can be one of two things depending on your actions. A bad future where Robotnik has completely industrialized the environment, and a good future where Robotnik's machinery and influences have been wrecked, creating what seems like a healthy balance between nature itself and human creations. Off the bat, I want to highlight that, in terms of shaping an atmosphere, the different time periods add a ton to the overall experience. The bleak states of the bad futures are the ultimate guilt trip that may motivate players to go back and fix all the damage done by the maniacal doctor, while the happiness and peacefulness of the good futures should give players a great sense of reward and fulfillment for going the extra mile and rescuing various areas of Little Planet. Every time period of each zone also sports different color palettes as well as different arrangements of the same composition to fit the mood, which means there's lots of art to marvel at and lots of music to gush about. The presentation of the game is extremely unique, varied, and memorable in that regard thanks to the time travel mechanic, and it's safe to say Sonic CD wouldn't be Sonic CD without it. In terms of gameplay, the time travel also offers good promise. When you find one of the signposts in a level that reads past or future and keep moving at or above a certain momentum threshold for roughly 3.5 seconds, you'll warp between time periods. If you come to a stop or lose a substantial amount of speed over these 3.5 seconds, your hedgehog ass ain't going nowhere. It's intriguing on paper, and I can see what the developers were going for here, challenging players to learn parts of level layouts and set up a setup to facilitate time time travel. This can be pretty difficult in certain scenarios because you're often cramped for space to run around in freely for long enough, forcing you to become creative. Here in Metallic Madness 1, for instance, I build enough momentum to hop over this area and activate the sparkly stars, yet control my velocity in such a way that I'm still able to jump and pull back enough as to land in between these two springs. See, I created that setup. I figured that shit out on my own, and thus I can definitely see the beauty of activating these time travel shenanigans. It's also a plus that this example tapped into mastering Sonic's controls and momentum, because a game should always strive to incorporate applications that support and put to use its core mechanics. Unfortunately, I'm only willing to defend the concept because the execution indeed leaves something to be desired. To begin with, there were times I felt I got cheated out of the time travel. You know, I'll be rolling or racing through an automated set piece of some kind, only for it to dick me over at the last possible moment. Here in the Quartz Quadrant Bad Future, for example, I hit a wall just a split second before activating a warp, and here in Stardust Speedway Present, an interfering speed-up device glitched out and caused Sonic to come to a jarring halt, which isn't even a level design issue, but more so one of programming of collision. Another instance of that is how running up the tiniest bit of an incline may kill your time travel. Like, really, why does this not count just because Sonic's sprite was very briefly at an angle? What the fuck is that about? Now, I won't imply this type of nonsense happens all the time. In many cases, a failed time travel was simply me screwing up, and I'm not going to disregard an entire mechanic based on some jank that occurs once every RZ upload. I draw the line though when the consequence for failing a time travel is so damn severe. If you fail to execute a time travel from the moment those sparkly stars appear around Sonic, you lose your ability to time travel altogether. While players should be punished for messing up, it basically equates to a lot of extra scouring through the levels to find a new past or future signpost to earn a second shot at time traveling. And then, once you do stumble upon one of these signposts again and are looking for a suitable place to use it, you constantly have to slow yourself down in order to prevent missing another opportunity at warping. These processes can be a hassle if you're a newcomer and form distracting, pace-breaking clutter around that core challenge of maintaining your momentum long enough to time travel, despite it being interesting in its own vacuum. This clutter and the aforementioned jank can also compound upon one another and frankly open the doors for frustration more than anything else if you ask me. I do have to mention that there are heaps of set pieces in most to all stages that grant you a freebie time travel with zero effort required. Think of two springs close to one another to infinitely bounce back and forth between, or some sort of other stage gimmick you can abuse to gain infinite momentum. This can be considered a good thing since it relieves you of the bullshit otherwise involved with activating a time travel. Simultaneously though, it defeats the point of players learning to maintain their speed and flow in a level and or create their own little setups to achieve that time travel. I would not have minded maybe one very difficult to find set piece for this purpose per level, but it's far from that in reality. Perhaps this was done to capitalize even more on the explorative nature of the game, but couldn't we just add more items to find instead if we needed more incentives for exploration beyond robot generators and time travel posts? I don't know, man, maybe I'm missing something here, but the more I think about this whole time travel mechanic, the more I feel like it wasn't thought about to a proper extent. To give some credit where it is due, dying does keep you in the current time period, so if you do die, you won't have to warp back to the past again from the present when you'd already done that before in the same stage. That's nice. What I also appreciate is that all the time travel signposts can be reset to the state they were in when you last crossed the checkpoint by committing suicide. This makes running out of past or future signposts in any given stage a near impossibility, so if you're in Act 2 of a zone, you don't have to reload your save file and redo Act 1 simply to be able to time travel again in Act 2. The American release of Sonic CD further streamlined this, as you can simply press A while the game is paused there to reset and restart the current act in exchange for an extra life. For that reason, the US version of the game is marginally superior over the Japanese version gameplay-wise. I do wish this feature was actually communicated proper by simple text spelling press A to restart stage or something, but what are you gonna do? When it all comes together though, I'm not the biggest fan of this robot generator stuff and trying to time travel. It's not a terrible quest, and I can definitely see how players who really love exploration and can take some questionable execution would find it entertaining. In its best moments, I even find it pretty enjoyable, and the more experience you have with time traveling and such, the more the jank fades. Getting used to the crap factor though is not a good excuse, and the quest simply falls short of being the truly worthwhile addition it could have been. Outside of creating good futures for all the areas in Little Planet, it's also very much an intrinsically driven quest. Seriously, flowers and a "you're too cool" message as a reward for all your effort? Get the fuck out of here! I don't think anybody would have been opposed to an 8th true final zone with a significantly different, and most importantly better, ending. I'ma drop some suggestions right now on how the quest potentially could have been improved, and though not everybody is going to agree with all of them, I think they're at least interesting food for thought. First of all, the game really should have had the option to revisit all stages already beaten at any time, which I think is self-explanatory. Secondly, I would have incorporated a better sense of direction for where the roboticizers are located. Maybe have areas with suspicious set pieces or visual design that low-key draws people's attention, a sound effect produced by the devices that get softer or louder depending on distance to guide you to the broad areas of interest without entirely giving away the precise locations. It doesn't have to be exactly something like I listed, but in that ballpark, you feel? Furthermore, the time traveling mechanic, that shit needs overhauling. Beyond the wonky collision and sparkly star stuff that could have been smoother and less picky, I'd say get rid of many of the bits of level design catered specifically toward effortless time traveling and give rings an additional function as a type of currency. If players lose the ability to time travel after a goofed up attempt, allow them to gain it back at any past or future signpost by trading in 10, 15, 20 rings, whatever balancing works the best within the game's level design really. This way, there would still be a punishment in place for failure, and while some trekking around would still be involved to the nearest past or future signpost, it would at least substantially cut down on the tedious and time-consuming clutter surrounding the mechanic. Another idea is to make transportation stars appear above the past and future signposts akin to Sonic 2's checkpoints. The maintaining of momentum challenge would be sacrificed altogether here, but the simplicity is arguably worth the trade-off. In that light, also not such a terrifying prospect is one where the time travel mechanics are gone altogether while keeping the atmosphere, graphics, and music of the various time periods. Make Act 1 the past, Act 2 the present, and depending on whether you destroyed all the robot generators or not, Act 3 the bad or good future. Most people barely ever go to either of the two futures anyway, because there's little of any value in them. In fact, the bad futures act more like obstacles to be avoided, since they remove you even further from the past. I actually don't mind that at all, but I also wouldn't lose sleep over it being gone. Anyway, it's also not unreasonable to think that if time travel mechanics had never come to fruition, the stage design in general would have been more polished and fleshed out, since more development time and effort could have been dedicated to that aspect. And if the time travel mechanics were to be fully cut, maybe make each act contain a total of 3 robot generators, or maybe make these useless Metal Sonic holograms actually worth the damn to compensate for the otherwise comparative lack of exploration. To take it even further, don't make the challenge just the process of finding the roboticizers, but also something that incorporates intricate platforming and Sonic's physics into the mix. There are so many examples throughout the classic series of secrets or shortcuts only reachable with clever thinking, mechanical mastery, or sometimes even a combination of the two, using the speed shoes in Green Hill 2 to gain enough momentum to reach the top of this loop with an extra life, using the speed shoes in Spring Yard 1 for a similar purpose to be able to launch yourself over a wall to skip the slow-moving block section. Now, picture how swell it would be if Sonic CD took this defining aspect of the classic Sonic gameplay and applied that to its level design when it comes to reaching various robot generators. Believe it or not, this is something the game doesn't actually do at all, as it's always merely a matter of searching for the roboticizers. Never does the design do anything with them outside of that. This is an absolute shame, because not only would implementing the physics and perhaps other general platforming design challenges act as a method of intuitively teaching players the nuances of the controls and mechanics, it would also make the Roboticizer side quest, and thus by extension the level design itself, more eventful and complex. Let's be honest here, that would have made for a hell of a lot more enticing Sonic CD because you know exactly where this is going. Let's begin with what seems to be the most common criticism aimed at Sonic CD's level design: how chaotic and nonsensical it can be. This is not my main complaint, but it's certainly a valid one. Half of the zones or so are pretty all over the place and trigger happy. Collision Chaos is Sonic CD's equivalent of the series' staple casino-themed areas, jam-packed with slopes, half-pipes, bumpers, flippers, springs, and what have you, and though not all of the zone is a hassle, there are times where a bunch of springs and bumpers are clogged together into a set piece, which makes it a bit of a pain to get around in properly and stop yourself from being flung around. You've also got those tall stacks of breakable glass balls in Act 2. I hate these things because it can take forever before you crack through enough of the pile to progress, and none of it adds anything of value to the stage besides arbitrarily halting progress. Many of you can probably also relate to the struggle of Wacky Workbench, where the floor is like an electric trampoline of sorts that automatically rockets Sonic upwards upon contact. This can absolutely be avoided with careful play, but when you are shot into the air, chances are you have to waste time running across vertically stacked paths one after another before you make it back to the bottom and continue. Either that, or you keep bouncing around in a vicious cycle because the visibility is too limited to allow you to see where you're going to land. I've had that happen trying to pass through a gap in the wall for a robot generator in Act 2, and let me tell ya, it was not a fun time. For me though, the worst offender has got to be the total clusterfuck known as Stardust Speedway. Tons of crap here that loves pushing you in unintended directions. Speed up devices that launch you ahead at a high speed, springs up the frickin' wazoo, you name it. There's nothing as grating and tiresome as just wanting to get up a ledge but being forcefully pushed upwards out of nowhere, or being guided through an array of connected, narrow speedways with springs often leading to nowhere, and buggy behavior that pushes you in the wrong direction or temporarily gets you stuck on something and thus break the flow. Then there are those goddamned flip cards. Many of the speedways that are layered over one another can be shifted to the front or back layer, however, jack shit changes about them visually when you do this, so it's never clear which track of the two is the solid one. I'm all for wacky gimmicks to make stages as distinct as possible, but stuff like this feels like being complicated for the sake of being complicated. There are other, smaller oddities throughout the game that make the level design come off as sloppy too. I've already mentioned how you gotta fall through a frickin' crusher in Wacky Workbench for a robot generator, but a couple of times what appears to be solid walls must also be passed through to advance in certain zones. Like in Tidal Tempest, there is this set piece where some blocks have no collision while others do, yet the visual design does not reflect that well. From what I gather, there are always rings to hint at those openings in the walls or whatever, but it feels inconsistent and I don't see what this type of shit adds. The worst example relating to awkward progression though is probably found in Metallic Madness. Here, you're supposed to stand on this pillar thing that shoots you up to a ledge above, but I mean, the movement speed of the pillar is way too slow to make you think you'll be shot upwards 1,000,000 miles an hour. All this stuff can make navigating the zones of Sonic CD a bit of a bitch, which, as you'd expect, is also undesirable when exploring for the robot generators. It's not something that kills the level design for me personally though, and thankfully not all stages are affected by this busyness, I guess, this hecticness. Tidal Tempest and Quartz Quadrant are very straightforward to get around in, for example, and aren't messy or annoying like the earlier examples. However, there's a larger problem with the level design that I see, namely that it doesn't have much on offer. It feels kind of bland and empty, even though the levels may not technically be empty. For instance, what the hell do I even tell you about Quartz Quadrant? It's got some completely randomly placed enemies to take on, a minimal amount of obstacles and threats to avoid, and a lack of unique gimmicks to interact with. There are some conveyor belts of which the moving direction can be changed with these arrowed panels, some vertical tunnels that suck you in and blast you through at a high speed, but these don't really accomplish anything. All I see beyond that are a bunch of different yet completely uneventful pathways, or sometimes small stretches of nothing at all. Tidal Tempest is the same story. You flick a switch to open a door here, pop a pushover enemy on the head there, get sucked through tubes sometimes, stand on this platform carried by rising water. Is this stuff even worth mentioning at all? Sure, Tidal Tempest is the obligatory water area in the game, but I've rarely ever drowned here because the design is so basic and uninvolved. Blasphemous opinion warning, but the way Labyrinth Zone in Sonic 1 continuously has enemies and hazards in different setups to work around, which also increases the risk of drowning, by the way, keeps me more invested in those stages than whatever the levels in Tidal Tempest are doing. That said, even those zones that do fall into that messy and annoying category don't have a good sense of purpose either. Stardust Speedway, in spite of appearing so intricately designed with a million different paths crisscrossing one another, lacks substance. Again, what do you actually do in this zone besides being blasted forward and getting nauseous? The platforming isn't interesting, and neither do many of the gimmicks amount to anything meaningful, like the launchers that switch angles and shoot you out on command, and most of the speed is completely automated and requires next to no effort to gain. It can be a visual spectacle to behold for sure though, which can hardly be said for any other zone in Sonic CD. Stardust Speedway is kind of like Chemical Plant in that regard, which was also quite automated, and I criticized it as such. However, I find Chemical Plant broke that spectacle up a bit more with some decent platforming and shortcuts and secrets to find using said speed. Actual meaningful content in short. Similarly, Collision Chaos has the potential to use its bouncy gimmicks and elements to tap into the classic Sonic physics system. However, it is not like Casino Night in that it sports carefully thought out challenges that require dexterity with those physics and bumpy objects to overcome. Just think about the slot machines in Casino Night. Not only are they an addictive staple of the zone and the franchise as a whole for that matter, they also encourage players to interact with all the pinball shenanigans going on, as Sonic or Tails would often have to be carefully shot into the slot machines while dodging surrounding bumpers and hazards. The pinball-esque nature of Collision Chaos, on the other hand, doesn't contribute much to any sort of greater goal or idea, as it has little in the way of engaging challenges. A lot of the terrain is either obstructive for the sake of it, like those breakable glass balls brought up before, or random and pointless, such as these 3 half-pipes next to one another in Act 2. Isn't one of them enough? What does having 3 accomplish exactly? This type of haphazard design in the stages is something you'll notice throughout the game, that many things were just placed to be placed. From the level design in Sonic 1 and 2, I've rarely got such an impression. Ironically, for as much as people tend to loathe Wacky Workbench, I think it is one of the zones with the most amount of meat and logic to it. Though this is a zone that greatly discourages speed, which conflicts with how people tend to play Sonic games, and though getting shot up tends to come with its own problems, there is a clearly defined challenge here with a clearly defined punishment. You gotta jump from moving platform to moving platform, and in Act 2 swing off of poles correctly here and there in order to prevent hitting the bottom. It's essentially a typical side-scrolling platformer task, but instead of a bottomless pit beneath your ass, it's the bouncy floor. Nevertheless, while Wacky Workbench has more platforming challenge in it than the majority of other zones, it's still too repetitive and basic for me to label it riveting gameplay. Most of the platforms move at the same speed and patterns, the spacing between them is hardly ever intimidating, and not too often are new gimmicks or enemies interfering to spice and shake things up. Donkey Kong Country tier platforming, this certainly ain't. The zone with the most amount of substance, however, is Metallic Madness. It feels more like something you would find in Sonic 1 or 2, where overcoming obstacles and avoiding threats are a part of the mix next to exploration. You've got the platforms from Scrap Rain that you fall through when they are spinning, those rotating anti-gravity discs from Scrap Rain that you must jump off of at the right time and properly to advance further, a section where you must navigate a mini Sonic through tight tunnels with hazards and enemies, the walker thing you have to bring to the end of a room while avoiding the falling fireballs from exploding bombs. A little of it is spectacular stuff, but new elements and things are continuously introduced or combined in a manner that gives the stages variety and a sense of challenge outside of exploration. Metallic Madness has got its own problems that could make somebody dislike it, one of them being the maze-like layout of Act 2 I've talked about, but at least it doesn't feel as random or shallow as most other zones. Now, I'm not oblivious to how, creating good futures for each area is supposed to be that which gives the levels more substance. I'll admit, the game was more engaging to me when tracking down robot generators and time traveling instead of running through the levels straight from point A to point B. I don't find, however, that the implementation of this side quest is strong and substantial substantial enough that it can mask the shortcomings of the level design. I'll repeat something I've said before. I would have liked the roboticizers to come in larger quantities and then with solid as fuck platforming, physics, and stage gimmick challenges behind them, in addition to locating them, not solely the latter. Not only because players will blitz the level once that one robot generator is found right now, not only because the joy of exploration tends to fade on repeat playthroughs when you know where everything is, but also because challenges like these would strengthen the level design itself. Players would actually be incentivized to learn how a zone's gimmicks and mechanics work, which they usually don't have to do now because a lot of said gimmicks and mechanics can be cleared or passed without giving them much thought. How about a scenario where the player must bounce from bumper to bumper in the air without falling down in collision chaos to reach a platform on the other side with a robot generator? Act 1 actually has this exact set piece, but with a ring box instead of a robot generator, so players are not at all encouraged to overcome this task or may not even be aware it exists. How about an underwater section with obstacles along the way, entitled Tempest, with a roboticizer at the end? It would make drowning an actual threat and give the water a substantial purpose. How about a part in Stardust Speedway where you gotta use those rotating launchers to time shots to the next one, all of them moving at different speeds and patterns, and maybe even with some interfering foes? I believe such bite-sized challenges leading to key objects and then multiple spread around every stage would fit Sonic CD's overall design marvelously. The lack of such set pieces is easily one of the game's biggest missteps. Now that I think about it, the stages in general don't give that many applications for the physics system. I've mentioned that activating time travels can potentially have players think outside the box by using the physics and Sonic's handling in a clever way. This is something that still holds true, and there are undoubtedly other examples to point to beyond the one I described in Metallic Madness. Unlike Sonic 2 and Sonic 1 to a lesser extent, however, many of the level layouts here are pretty angular and blocky, not very rounded and smooth with curves and slopes. Look up zoom outs of all the zones in Sonic CD and it's a theme you'll surely notice. Angular and blocky levels are not inherently a bad thing in games, but such levels don't allow for our Blue Hedgehog's physics and mechanics to shine. It's one of the reasons speedrunning stages in this game really isn't that fun in my opinion, since timing jumps and rolls is not as integral to setting record times here as it is in Sonic 2 and even Sonic 1. Shortcuts to skip slow or difficult areas are also practically non-existent. There's little speaking of tricky to clear but rewarding in speed routes, and barring Stardust Speedway and maybe Palm Tree Panic, fast set pieces with loop-de-loops and such are pretty lacking and absent, as I've hinted at, taking away a part of that staple Sonic sensation. I have to stress again that this approach of heavily emphasizing exploration over speed is not an objectively wrong direction, but when the exploration leaves me unimpressed, yeah, I start searching for other aspects to compensate, and doing the stages as fast as possible didn't cut it for me. And I'm not even saying the exploration didn't impress me purely on the basis of those robot generators and time-traveling shenanigans, it's also the secrets in the form of ring boxes, extra lives, invincibility stars, and shields to snoop up. These are scattered through each stage, which is good because that means players have something else to explore and be rewarded for outside of the time travel posts and the single roboticizer. Despite that, I find that they were more cleverly implemented in Sonic 1 and 2, and this, once more, relates to the use of momentum and physics and also stage gimmicks. Though there are absolutely secrets in CD that require use of the momentum and physics or a specific stage gimmick to reach, like demonstrated here, I simply don't remember them being as common. A lot of the items are about finding them, more so than pulling off something fancy to get to them, and that's not to say they cannot be well hidden. I never knew about being able to pass through this wall here in Palm Tree Panic 1 for 2 1-ups, for instance, but I did miss some of that diversity you would see in Sonic 1 and 2. There's also the fact that Sonic CD has significantly less punishing and dangerous levels, and that there is a save system that boots you back to the start of the zone instead of the entire game upon a game over. As such, the value of rings and 1-ups in particular particular has dropped substantially, since in Sonic 1 and 2, every life and continue could make the difference between finishing or not finishing the game as a newcomer. Sure, they're of little importance to experienced players, but for Sonic CD, the lives, and to a lesser extent the rings, barely serve a meaningful purpose from the very beginning, undermining the satisfaction of obtaining them. On its own, this is not the end of the world, but combined with all the other complaints I've explained, it should be apparent why I find Sonic CD's level design to fall short compared to its predecessors. For the most part, it's not offensive or anything, it's just kind of an undercooked mess, and I'm never quite sure what to make of a lot of the stages. It's not all negative though, because Sonic CD being less cheap and trial and error based, I'd say that is actually one of its major benefits over Sonic 1 and 2. I like those games alright, but the placement of enemies, hazards, pits, or even instant kill obstacles in them can often be bullshit. Due to the overall speed, the lack of a panning screen, and sometimes outright bad design, it's frequently nigh impossible for players to avoid getting hit or dying completely unless they play extremely carefully or memorize the stage layouts. For both titles, I could show to you examples of spots where newcomers could easily be trapped into a pit or crusher of some kind, and I really need not explain how much of a mess zones like Scrap Rain, Oil Ocean, and Metropolis are. Mix that stuff together with the aforementioned limited continue system, and you've got yourself some flawed difficulty balancing that hurts the accessibility of Sonic 1 and 2. Sonic CD, by contrast, is far more forgiving. Next to progress being saved at every new zone, bottomless pits are entirely absent throughout the entire adventure, Metallic Madness 3 notwithstanding. Not to discredit bottomless pits, they can make platforming challenges infinitely more dangerous and challenging, but when they aren't telegraphed well or you're knocked back into them or whatever, they end up feeling harsh and unfair. Maybe removing bottomless pits altogether in Sonic CD was a bit drastic, but at least players never have to worry about them at all here, and similarly, the number of crushers and other instant kill objects has been limited drastically from my experience. The potential is still there, but I've suffered maybe 3 crush deaths in total across 6 or so playthroughs, hardly offensive. Even the enemy placement is less problematic. Metallic Madness is the only place that is bullshit incarnate, with these nutjobs roaming around that have their spikes far extended to the sides. I never see these motherfuckers in time, and spikes in so many uncalled for places, mostly being sneakily smacked on the ceilings. Even if you're suspecting these spikes, there's no way of telling their location in advance, so you could easily be blindsided, even if you're being careful. Outside of Metallic Madness though, I really wasn't that bothered. You absolutely can still run into foes that pop up out of nowhere, be flung into spikes by springs without much control, or go somewhere and crash into random, nonsensically placed spikes, but overall, this type of jazz is not that prevalent of a theme in Sonic CD, I found. This is hard to pinpoint and demonstrate eloquently with examples, but the panning camera we have now is probably a good contributor. When Sonic reaches a certain speed value, the screen shifts to the left or right depending on what direction he's running in. Hallelujah, it took him long enough. I've always questioned why Sonic 1 and 2 especially lacked a panning camera, so I'm glad to see Sonic CD finally implemented the feature. It isn't perfect and doesn't always help, it activates a little late for my tastes and doesn't behave as organically and smoothly as in Donkey Kong Country, for instance. I just cannot stop mentioning that game, maybe because it's really good, but there have certainly been circumstances where the extra visibility and thus time to react has prevented me from ramming headfirst into harmful crap. I realize I've been very harsh on Sonic CD for most of this retrospective so far, and I stand by all of it, but I also cannot stress enough how all these tweaks and additions to Sonic CD in regards to difficulty balancing make it a much more accessible and relaxing game to get into than Sonic 1 and 2. Heck, it's not even merely the main adventure where this is a welcome improvement, but also when it comes to entering the special stages. Alright, so in Sonic 1, entering special stages is done by reaching the end of an act with 50 rings or more. It's not a bad system on paper, because this ring goal makes for a decent reason to explore, and also incentivizes the player to play a little more cautiously. One of the biggest problems with it, however, is that the main levels have plenty of instances of bad enemy and hazard placement, and some questionable bottomless pits. As such, it's frustrating as hell to get hit or die by something you couldn't foresee, especially near the end of a level. Sonic CD uses the exact same system, but surprisingly enough, I don't find it nearly as aggravating. You can certainly still lose your rings by surprise motherfucker shenanigans, but it's not as common or devastating here. For one, we now have a panning screen, helping you to see further ahead of you, and the level design is more forgiving in general. These things, self-explanatory, make it easier to hold on to all that pocketed gold. Secondly, all the stages in CD are very backtrack friendly, as discussed with the robot generators, meaning you have the option to go back and collect rings you skipped over. Thirdly, each stage has 4 different time periods, all with their own selection of rings, so it's hard to imagine having no rings left to collect. You'd have to time travel, yes, but it shouldn't be as time consuming when both the past and future are viable to go to in this case. Furthermore, if you really screwed yourself out of getting 50 rings, Sonic CD's save system allows you to retry. Granted, the save system only records progress by zones, not by individual acts, so you may need to redo Act 1 of that zone in a special stage. This segues me to the final point, however. There are 7 zones in the game, with the 2 main acts giving you the opportunity to enter a special stage. There are 7 time stones to amass, meaning that if you wanted to and played your cards right, you could get all time stones from the first act of each zone. All of these things are to say that earning tickets to special stages is far more forgiving here than it is in Sonic 1, probably Sonic 2 as well, and I'm happy to say that the special stages themselves are the best so far in the 16-bit titles. You control Sonic in an open playfield, objective being to chase down and destroy all the gray UFOs flying across the map before time runs out. These special stages are much better designed compared to before, if you ask me, as winning comes down to your ability to keep track of the UFOs surrounding you and to learn the intricacies of the gameplay mechanics. Better so, Sonic CD actually gives you the time and chance to learn said mechanics. You can learn that touching the water drains a lot of time quickly. You can learn that biting teeth on the ground and patches of grass slow you down. And you can learn to use the fans and springs on the floor to your advantage to cross larger pools of water, as well as means of soaring or launching yourself into nearby UFOs if that helps you. The difficulty curve is solid, with the earlier missions allowing you to mess around a bit and get accustomed, and the later ones less so. Yet, even in those harder special stages, there is always a way to make a comeback with skillful play, as blue UFOs that restore some time will infinitely respawn as soon as the clock goes under 20 seconds remaining. It may sound like this trivializes the entire challenge, but you'd be surprised how easily you can still run out of time. The important difference, though, is that the difficulty now doesn't come from trial and error and having to memorize what's ahead like in Sonic 2's half-pipes, neither does it come from confusing navigation, awkward controls and gravity, and hard to anticipate on hazards that immediately kick you out like in Sonic 1's rotating mazes. At the same time, I'd be lying if I said Sonic CD special stages are perfect. While the controls are competent, you're never told you can slow Sonic down by holding down on the D-pad. This is a helpful and I'd even argue vital tool, since your turning radius is massive at full speed, making it a pain in the ass to line yourself up with UFOs that are zooming all over the place, as well as avoid outer planes of water. It really would not have hurt to display a quick overview of the controls and what everything does before the missions begin, so players aren't needlessly losing stages. The biggest problem, however, is the technology itself. The special stages have always been about showing off impressive, unusual graphics achieved on the Mega Drive, and in the case of Sonic CDs, it is the rotation and scaling of tile maps and sprites, which is a Mega CD hardware feature. Unfortunately, be it due to unoptimized code or actual system limitations, the playfield only refreshes at 20 frames per second. The result is choppy and unpleasing motion, which is further accentuated by the scaling of the UFOs, only consisting of a few steps between distant and up close. Judging the positioning of these bastards relative to Sonic is kinda awkward, and the at times questionable collision detection can make landing hits even trickier. It definitely feels rough, and I understand if that turns people off from these special stages. Me personally, I don't think the jank is that bad, certainly not as bad as the issues in special stages of previous installments. The ones in Sonic CD present most of the information you need to you well enough, control fine, give ample opportunities to make mistakes and recover from them, and are the most interesting on top of that for me. There are more elements to take into consideration here than just staring left or right in an ongoing hallway, you know? Combine the special stages themselves with the process of entering them being smoother than before, and I think you've actually got a solid side quest. Unexpectedly losing all your Casherino to a surprise enemy or something still sucks, but amassing 50 rings is free of all the time travel headaches and exhaustively scouring through the stages for one specific item. The rings requirement provides some small incentive to explore various nooks and crannies, and also ensures you cannot just bum rush your way to the finish, not giving a crap about taking damage as you go. Ultimately, going for all the time stones adds a bit more meat to the adventure than simply going from point A to point B in these otherwise underwhelming and short levels, especially considering the special stages themselves provide some additional variety to the core gameplay. I think this may be the most recommendable way to play Sonic CD, honestly. Of course, I've always got something to whine about though. In this case, I think the quest could have been more than solid with some different ideas. Despite it being less of a struggle, I'd still tweak how to access the special stages. Make it so that you have to amass a certain cumulated amount of rings across the 3 acts of a zone. For example, you need, say, for the sake of argument, 600 rings to unlock the special stage in Collision Chaos, and those 600 rings can be acquired across all the acts. Gain 300 in Act 1, 200 in Act 2, and 100 in Act 3, whatever combination really, and then the special stage opens up on a world map of sorts if you meet that ring goal. Since there are 7 zones and 7 time stones, each zone would have a special stage tied to it. This would then go in conjunction with the aforementioned ability to replay any act of any zone you've already beaten, and the ability to retry and revisit the unlocked special stages as much as you want. A concern could be that it would make the stages too easy, but all they need to do is bump up the difficulty level to counterbalance. After all, throwing the player a harder task is completely reasonable if they can get more practice at it, in this case, unlimited practice. The working of the ring system would need to be adjusted accordingly as well though, because high ring requirements to unlock special stages, taking a single hit and losing all rings? Ooh, that would be horrifying. So, to circumvent this, Sonic could have a couple of hit points or a health bar that are regenerated by collecting whatever amount of rings would work within the game's difficulty balancing. Moreover, you wouldn't lose any rings upon taking damage or losing a life, and the rings you collect would be in your pockets forever, kind of like the gems in Spyro the Dragon. In doing this, you'd never have to recollect the rings you've already got before all over again, but more thorough exploration of the levels would still be encouraged with these high ring requirements. 50 rings to the goal is fine and all, but that's an amount you can well reach with minimal to no exploration. It's only when you do take damage that you'll have to start searching around more. And I don't know about you, but I think a proper reward for achieving all time stones would be cool too. It'd be sick if they were Chaos Emeralds instead and we got Supersonic, and maybe they could have even tossed in some bonuses like concept art and such for every gem obtained. Practically any other extrinsic reward would be more fulfilling than that good ending with its "you're too cool" nonsense, which also happens when you destroy all the robot generators. Don't get me wrong, it's nice that players can see the good ending through either of these side quests, allowing them to pick their favorite and get the same outcome, but I think 2 separate, more worthwhile rewards would have been the better approach. The last topic to talk about regarding gameplay would be the boss fights. Sonic CD's bosses tend to be commended for having gimmicky and experimental concepts, and while I as well can appreciate the developers trying something different, different doesn't always equal good. Terrible is not the word I'm looking for, it's more that many are painfully simple. The Title Tempest boss, for instance, is nothing more than Robotnik soaring from left to right while shooting a set of 4 diverging bullets at you every now and then. The idea is that the Mustachio Man is protected by these rotating air bubbles surrounding him, which Sonic has to inhale to gain access to the mobile itself, but how engaging is that? Okay, what about the Palm Tree Panic boss then? Another joke that can be dealt with in a split second if you stand behind it when it first lands. Palm Tree Panic is the first zone, I'll give it that, but the Wrecking Ball in Sonic 1 at least has some threat to it. I'm not gonna say the bosses in Sonic 1 and 2 are especially remarkable either, but at least the majority can be defeated incredibly fast with the right strategy and timing. That ability to do it fast with practice is that one aspect of the Robotnik encounters in those games that gave them a bit of serviceable depth. Meanwhile, the boss in Quad Quadrant has you repetitively running on a treadmill of sorts and jumping over dropped bombs for nearly a minute straight, and it's impossible to make it go by any quicker no matter what you do. Mercifully, none of the battles are nearly as drawn out as the shit you face in Sonic 4 Episode 2, so there is at least that. Believe it or not, I do kind of like the Collision Chaos encounter, which is basically a pinball area with various nooks and crannies and obstacles to get around to reach the center top portion. A lot of people hate this boss because the pinball physics and collision detection are pretty botched, and Robotnik tends to drop balls on your noggin that bounce you back down. It's certainly not great, but I don't know, at least there is something going on here with a moderate challenge, and you can clear it pretty fast when you get good. And have luck on your side, admittedly. The Metal Sonic scene is worth discussing in greater depth though, because it is probably the most defining scene of the whole game. That said, I gotta be honest that I think the legacy of this one stems more from the set piece, music, and Metal Sonic as a character, rather than the execution of the race itself. You're mainly trying to outrun Robotnik's instant death laser by anticipating incoming obstacles such as uphills to jump over or run up properly, all the while racing Metal Sonic and trying to avoid his attacks. Sometimes the layout is kind of counterintuitive, like you naturally hold down and roll to pick up speed on connected slopes, only for spikes to put you to a stop with limited time to react, but for the most part it works quite alright. There is certainly some memorization required to clear all this stuff perfectly, but a good amount of it is also based on reflexes and handling Sonic properly. My main gripe really is the rubber banding. If you're ahead of Metal Sonic, he will soon manage to catch up to you and possibly electrocute your scrawny butt, and if you're behind, he'll slow down to cut you some slack. I guess. I understand that this was done to maintain the tension and excitement, but the trade-off is that, well, you could suck royal dick, yet nail the home stretch and still claim the victory, or you could be rocking it for the majority of the course, yet make one or two small mistakes and fall behind close to the finish as a result. I think the better approach would have been to pre-script Metal Sonic's movement, but give him some minimal AI to assault you whenever you're in his range. In my opinion, the loss of some of that tension of having Metal Sonic near you at all times is a sacrifice worth making if it means performance is the key to victory. And maybe it's just me, but seeing how much longer Metal Sonic takes than your pro ass, I think that'd be satisfying in its own right. Now we're just left with the final boss found in Metallic Madness, and he's frankly a pushover. You can carry rings from the stage into the fight, which may seem like an improvement over Sonic 2's bullshit of giving you no rings at all, but I think that would have actually worked better here in Sonic CD, or at least a shield for one extra hit. The attacks and patterns are simplistic enough that it would be more than acceptable, because now you can cheese the boss extremely easily by abusing the ring system. It's a very underwhelming conclusion to the game if I say so myself. I'll take it over the Death Egg Robot any day, but Sonic 1's final boss reigns supreme among these three titles if you ask me. Honestly, why isn't Metal Sonic the final battle instead of this baby shit? That would have made more sense, dogs. Following the final boss is a full-motion ending showing Sonic and Amy escaping Little Planet. Now this is easily one of the most memorable aspects of Sonic CD. The two animated cutscenes, one at the start of the game and one at the end, created with the intention to take full advantage of the capabilities of the CD technology. If I'm not mistaken, this was the first time the world had seen our favorite speedster in such an animated fashion, and the scenes are awesome to watch to this day with a great hand-drawn style. After all, it was done by the Toei Animation Studio, most famous for doing the Dragon Ball series. The way Sonic looks and how he is portrayed is difficult not to adore. He's silent, but a total badass nonetheless that's always on edge and going fast, with a ton of personality conveyed through his movement and facial expressions. He's seen spin dashing through a bunch of falling rocks, running up a steep cliff and rolling off of it, destroying a bunch of enemies in style and racing against Metal Sonic along the Stardust Speedway and more, and all the while he seems to be having a fucking cracker of a time. It's a pleasure to watch, and I'm not surprised Tyson Hesse Sonic is so heavily based on this one. Sadly, the original Mega CD release of the game displays these videos at an incredibly low frame rate with a limited number of colors and in a small screen size to boot. This probably could not be helped by the programmers, but thankfully the real, unedited, and uncompressed deal is readily available for all of our bodies to enjoy these days through various means. Outside of these FMVs, however, Sonic CD is not a very convincing upgrade on a technical level. Despite the Mega CD packing a blast processor clocked around 63% higher than the Mega Drive, the game is hampered by performance dips more so than Sonic 1 and 2, sometimes in instances where you wouldn't even expect them. Research tells me that Sonic CD reuses a lot of Nakasan's original code from Sonic 1, but considering little of the game logic here seems wildly more complex than before, it's odd and also disappointing that Sonic CD has more slowdown on a faster machine. Oshima-san once actually stated that had Naka-san been the chief programmer for Sonic CD, he believed the game would have been more optimized. The transition between time periods in particular is something he really wished was more seamless. As it is now, due to the optical media, the transitions go on for about 7 seconds if you skip the mini cutscenes. This isn't unbearable since time travel doesn't happen all the time, but it's a bit of a break in the action that could have stood to be shorter. When it comes to graphical fidelity too, Sonic CD could largely pass as a Mega Drive title. This was to be expected, to be fair, because the Mega CD didn't expand the hardware capabilities notably beyond some hardware-supported scaling and rotating. That said, these features are hardly, if at all, employed in the main stages and reserved for the special stages alone. Now, the vastly larger storage of CDs compared to cartridges did help a lot, having more than enough capacity available for the wide range of assets and varying color palettes for all the levels. And this is where the visuals shine, the different looks of the 4 time periods. It really does lend a sense of scope and atmosphere to this journey that you simply didn't get in Sonic 1 or 2. The plot in Sonic CD is a little more complex than what had been done before, it's just framed more interestingly with higher stakes, with Amy being kidnapped and Metal Sonic being a rival equally fast as Sonic, but the environmental changes tell an additional story, the story of Little Planet, without using cutscenes or words. Quartz Quadrant is a stunning looking cavern with a large number of crystals in the background in the past, but then fast forward to the present, and the crystals are in the process of being extracted by machinery. Once we reach the bad future, Robotnik's artificial creations have taken the place of the crystals entirely, whereas in the good future, the mining has come to an end and glimmers of the crystals can be seen shining through. You may not notice these details initially, but take the time to observe Sonic's surroundings, and you'll be able to discover similar progressions in all of the zones. A few of the themes are quite imaginative and stand out in the series in general, such as Wacky Workbench. It appears to be some kind of warehouse storing who knows what, and the abundance of abstract mechanisms gives the area that out there Sonic CD look that people enjoy. My one complaint in terms of aesthetic though would have to be that many of the zones feel somewhat derivative of Sonic 1. Palm Tree Panic and Green Hill, Tidal Tempest and Labyrinth, Stardust Speedway and Starlight, they all look distinct enough that it's not a deal breaker by any means, but the comparisons can be shockingly simple to make. Following talk about the visuals is of course talk about the soundtrack, which is composed by Naofumi Hataya and Masafumi Ogata. Similarly to the graphical assets, the music also changes depending on the time period you're in, which not only works in tandem with the visuals to further enhance Little Planet as a setting, it also makes for a very diversified selection of music to listen to. There may not be altered arrangements for the second acts of zones like Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but a total of 4 variations for each piece is certainly nothing to sneeze at. And thankfully, this isn't a case where the quantity has come at the cost of quality because so many of the tracks are extremely memorable and a joy to listen to. I love at least one arrangement of each of the zone's pieces, and You Can Do Anything, Cosmic Eternity, and the special stage music get the RZ seal of approval as well, if that means anything. Not everything is great, I find most versions of Wacky Workbench pretty forgettable just to name something, and the boss theme is kinda weird weird and unfitting, but I secretly kinda like it though. Lastly, since this is a Mega CD game, the soundtrack was bound to be one of CD quality audio. Sonic 1 and 2 are absolutely good sounding by Mega Drive standards, but Sonic CD blows them out of the water with better instrument samples and synths, and more sophisticated mixing that gives everything an extra layer of richness. It's the cherry on top that pushes the Japanese soundtrack of the game to top 5 material within the franchise for me. Then we've got the American soundtrack. Likely because Sega of America considered the Japanese music too alienating for their market, a new score was composed for the US release of Sonic CD by Spencer Nilsson with assistance from David Young and Mark Crew here and there. The result is a soundtrack that is best described as utterly different. Where the Japanese music was very energetic and bouncy most of the time, the American music is all around considerably more toned down and focused on atmosphere. Notice how the Japanese track for Stardust Shitway plays into the hectic, lively nature of the zone with the horn instruments along the roads. Now listen to the American counterpart, which plays more into the starry background in the middle of the night. Both pieces fit the levels, but for their own reasons. This goes for the majority of the game, and so it's really up to personal preference which soundtrack you prefer. For me, while I do enjoy the American stuff and appreciate what it brings to the table in terms of atmosphere, half of it blends in and came out kinda drab. The American soundtrack definitely has its gems, like Palm Tree Panic and the demonstrated Stardust Speedway, and I'll take the Sonic Boom song over the Japanese themes for the opening and ending scenes. However, stuff like Collision Chaos and Metallic Madness is too bland for my tastes. I couldn't even recall what they were like until looking them up just now. I also find that the Good and Bad Future tracks sometimes don't sound much like Good or Bad Futures and may even be a tad tricky to distinguish from one another as such. With the Japanese counterparts, this doesn't happen, as the Good and Bad Futures are almost always easily identifiable from the moment they begin. Oh, and since the past arrangements of the Japanese compositions are sequenced with samples rather than streamed audio from the CD, the American compositions lack their own past tunes. As a result, the Japanese tunes play instead, creating a jarring mismatch with the rest of the American soundtrack. For these reasons, I wouldn't rank the American soundtrack nearly as high as the Japanese one. Still, two interpretations ultimately means more music for us, and to this day it remains a pretty discussed topic amongst fans which is better, showing that there is love for both scores. Sonic CD is an interesting beast. It's often lauded as one of the best Sonic titles ever made, and it's not difficult to see why. It marked the debut of mainstay characters Amy Rose and Metal Sonic, and it's got a unique sense of style, atmosphere, and presentation that is to be loved and appreciated. Beyond that, it's got some good gameplay qualities. The special stages may just be some of the most competent and fun in the franchise, and the game is more accessible than its predecessors thanks to the significantly reduced number of cheap trial and error elements balance, and a save system. This makes Sonic CD a welcoming experience to come back to every now and then, to just be taken away by, to run through mindlessly, to relax in. And hey, if you were never a fan of Sonic's focus on speed, and if the concept of exploring large, sprawling stages with the character instead sounds exciting to you, this title could be right up your alley. Ultimately though, I find that the execution in many key gameplay areas falls short. I say more power to the developers for wanting to put exploration at the forefront, but the way the robot generators were implemented, time travel and all included, just wasn't thought out and elaborate enough if you ask me. This would have been fine by me if the level design stood tall, but I often find it underwhelming and devoid of interesting activities and challenges when it isn't being a random mess. Controversial as it may be, I do believe the stages would have come out better had the time travel mechanics been abandoned early on, and if additionally the robot generator and time stone quests had been tightened up with the various suggestions laid out in this retrospective, Sonic CD could have been an awesome exploration platformer. What we ended up with instead is not a bad game in my opinion, but it's one that struggled to flesh out its core gameplay aspects to something remarkable, one with some serious missed potential. In spite of that, there's nothing quite like Sonic CD, and it remains a memorable experimental game in Sega's history, one that I can still have some fun with. And that wraps up the long overdue retrospective on Sonic CD. I hope you got something out of it, and hey, if you haven't seen them yet, feel free to check out my reviews on Sonic 1, 2, and maybe even 3D Blast. Those were all done before I began experimenting with this new format, but the content is very similar, so you'll probably enjoy them all the same. Also, if you would like immediate access to full retrospectives the moment their first part goes up, you can totally get that, as well as the other perks listed on the Patreon page for the price of $1 per full retrospective. There's no monthly charge, so you only pay when content is actually finished. That said, special shoutouts to all the patrons displayed on screen for supporting the channel, and of course, thank you all for tuning in.